v.I. Lenin. The Trade Unions, the Present Situation and Trotsky's Mistakes, Footnote 1. Speech delivered at a joint meeting of Communist delegates to the 8th Congress of Soviets, Communist members of the All-Russia Central Council of Trade Unions and Communist members of the Moscow City Council of Trade Unions, December 30, 1920. Delivered December 30, 1920. First published in pamphlet form in 1921, published according to the pamphlet text collated with the verbatim report edited by Lenin. Source: Lenin's Collected Works, First English Edition, Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1965, Volume 32, pages 19 to 42. Comrades, I must first of all apologize for departing from the rules of procedure, for anyone wishing to take part in the debate should have heard the report, the second report and the speeches. I am so unwell, unfortunately, that I have been unable to do this. But I was able yesterday to read the principal printed documents and to prepare my remarks. This departure from the rules will naturally cause you some inconvenience. Not having heard the other speeches, I may go over old ground and leave out what should be dealt with. But I had no choice. My principal material is Comrade Trotsky's pamphlet, The Role and Tasks of the Trade Unions. When I compare it with the theses he submitted to the Central Committee, and go over it very carefully, I am amazed at the number of theoretical mistakes and glaring blunders it contains. How could anyone starting a big party discussion on this question produce such a sorry excuse for a carefully thought-out statement? Let me go over the main points which, I think, contain the original fundamental theoretical errors. Trade unions are not just historically necessary, they are historically inevitable as an organization of the industrial proletariat, and, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, embrace nearly the whole of it. This is basic, but Comrade Trotsky keeps forgetting it. He neither appreciates it nor makes it his point of departure, all this while dealing with the role and tasks of the trade unions, a subject of infinite compass. It follows from what I have said that the trade unions have an extremely important part to play at every step of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But what is their part? I find that it is a most unusual one, as soon as I delve into this question, which is one of the most fundamental theoretically. On the one hand, the trade unions, which take in all industrial workers, are an organization of the ruling, dominant, governing class, which has now set up a dictatorship and is exercising coercion through the state. But it is not a state organization, nor is it one designed for coercion, but for education. It is an organization designed to draw in and to train. It is, in fact, a school of administration, a school of economic management, a school of communism. It is a very unusual type of school, because there are no teachers or pupils. This is an extremely unusual combination of what has necessarily come down to us from capitalism, and what comes from the ranks of the advanced revolutionary detachments, which you might call the revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat. To talk about the role of the trade unions without taking these truths into account is to fall straight into a number of errors. Within the system of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the trade unions stand, if I may say so, between the party and the government. In the transition to socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat is inevitable, but it is not exercised by an organization which takes in all industrial workers. Why not? The answer is given in the theses of the Second Congress of the Communist International on the role of political parties in general. I will not go into this here. What happens is that the party, shall we say, absorbs the vanguard of the proletariat, and this vanguard exercises the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship cannot be exercised or the functions of government performed without a foundation such as the trade unions. These functions, however, have to be performed through the medium of special institutions which are also of a new type, namely, the Soviets. What are the practical conclusions to be drawn from this peculiar situation? They are, on the one hand, that the trade unions are a link between the vanguard and the masses, and by their daily work bring conviction to the masses of the class which alone is capable of taking us from capitalism to communism. On the other hand, the trade unions are a reservoir of the state power. This is what the trade unions are in the period of transition from capitalism to communism. In general, this transition cannot be achieved without the leadership of that class which is the only class capitalism has trained for large-scale production and which alone is divorced from the interests of the petty proprietor. But the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be exercised through an organization embracing the whole of that class, because in all capitalist countries, and not only over here, in one of the most backward, the proletariat is still so divided, so degraded, and so corrupted in parts, by imperialism in some countries, that an organization taking in the whole proletariat cannot directly exercise proletarian dictatorship. It can be exercised only by a vanguard that has absorbed the revolutionary energy of the class. The whole is like an arrangement of cogwheels. Such is the basic mechanism of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and of the essentials of transition from capitalism to communism. From this alone it is evident that there is something fundamentally wrong in principle when Comrade Trotsky points, in his first thesis, to ideological confusion, and speaks of a crisis as existing specifically and particularly in the trade unions. If we are to speak of a crisis, we can do so only after analyzing the political situation. It is Trotsky who is in ideological confusion, because in this key question of the trade union's role, from the standpoint of transition from capitalism to communism, he has lost sight of the fact that we have here a complex arrangement of cogwheels which cannot be a simple one, for the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be exercised by a mass proletarian organization. It cannot work without a number of transmission belts running from the vanguard to the mass of the advanced class, and from the latter to the mass of the working people. In Russia, this mass is a peasant one. There is no such mass anywhere else, but even in the most advanced countries there is a non-proletarian, or a not entirely proletarian, mass. That is in itself enough to produce ideological confusion. But it's no use Trotsky's pinning it on others. When I consider the role of the trade unions in production, find that Trotsky's basic mistake lies in his always dealing with it in principle, as a matter of general principle. All his theses are based on general principle, an approach which is in itself fundamentally wrong, quite apart from the fact that the Ninth Party Congress said enough and more than enough about the trade union's role in production, footnote 2, and quite apart from the fact that in his own theses Trotsky quotes the perfectly clear statements of Lazovsky and Tomsky, who were to be his whipping boys and an excuse for an exercise in polemics. It turns out that there is, after all, no clash of principle, and the choice of Tomsky and Lazovsky, who wrote what Trotsky himself quotes, was an unfortunate one indeed. However hard we may look, we shall not find here any serious divergence of principle. In general, Comrade Trotsky's great mistake, his mistake of principle, lies in the fact that by raising the question of principle at this time he is dragging back the party and the Soviet power. We have, thank heaven, done with principles and have gone on to practical business. We chatted about principles rather more than we should have at the Smolny. Today, 3 years later, we have decrees on all points of the production problem, and on many of its components, but such is the sad fate of our decrees they are signed, and then we ourselves forget about them and fail to carry them out. Meanwhile, arguments about principles and differences of principle are invented. I shall later on quote a decree dealing with the trade union's role in production, a decree all of us, including myself, I confess, have forgotten. The actual differences, apart from those I have listed, really have nothing to do with general principles. I have had to enumerate my differences with Comrade Trotsky because, with such a broad theme as the role and tasks of the trade unions, he has, I am quite sure, made a number of mistakes bearing on the very essence of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But, this apart, one may well ask, why is it that we cannot work together, as we so badly need to do? It is because of our different approach to the mass, the different way of winning it over and keeping in touch with it. That is the whole point. And this makes the trade union a very peculiar institution, which is set up under capitalism, which inevitably exists in the transition from capitalism to communism, and whose future is a question mark. The time when the trade unions are actually called into question is a long way off. It will be up to our grandchildren to discuss that. What matters now is how to approach the mass, to establish contact with it and win it over, and how to get the intricate transmission system working, how to run the dictatorship of the proletariat. Note that when I speak the intricate transmission system, I do not mean the machinery of the Soviets. What it may have in the way of intricacy of transmission comes under a special head. I have only been considering, in principle and in the abstract, class relations in capitalist society, which consists of a proletariat, a non-proletarian mass of working people, a petty bourgeoisie and a bourgeoisie. This alone yields an extremely complicated transmission system owing to what has been created by capitalism, quite apart from any red tape in the Soviet administrative machinery. And that is the main point to be considered in analyzing the difficulties of the trade union's task. Let me say this again: the actual differences do not lie where Comrade Trotsky sees them, but in the question of how to approach the mass, win it over, and keep in touch with it. I must say that had we made a detailed, even if small-scale, study of our own experience and practices, we should have managed to avoid the hundreds of quite unnecessary differences and errors of principle in which Comrade Trotsky's pamphlet abounds. Some of his theses, for instance, polemicize against Soviet trade unionism. As if we hadn't enough trouble already, a new bogey has been invented. Who do you think it is? Comrade Ryazanov, of all people. I have known him for 20-odd years. You have known him less than that, but equally as well by his work. You are very well aware that assessing slogans is not one of his virtues, which he undoubtedly has. Shall we then produce theses to show that Soviet trade unionism is just something that Comrade Ryazanov happened to say with little relevance? Is that being serious? If it is, we shall end up with having Soviet trade unionism, Soviet anti-peace signing, and what not. A Sovietism could be invented on every single point. Ryazanov Soviet anti-Brestism. Exactly, Soviet anti-Brestism. While betraying this lack of thoughtfulness, Comrade Trotsky falls into error himself. He seems to say that in a workers' state it is not the business of the trade unions to stand up for the material and spiritual interests of the working class. That is a mistake. Comrade Trotsky speaks of a workers' state. May I say that this is an abstraction? It was natural for us to write about a workers' state in 1917, but it is now a patent error to say, since this is a workers' state without any bourgeoisie, against whom then is the working class to be protected, and for what purpose? The whole point is that it is not quite a workers' state. That is where Comrade Trotsky makes one of his main mistakes. We have got down from general principles to practical discussion and decrees, and here we are being dragged back and prevented from tackling the business at hand. This will not do. For one thing, ours is not actually a workers' state but a workers' and peasants' state. And a lot depends on that. Bukharin, what kind of state? A workers' and peasants' state. Comrade Bukharin back there may well shout what kind of state? A workers' and peasants' state. I shall not stop to answer him. Anyone who has a mind to should recall the recent Congress of Soviets, Footnote 3, and that will be answer enough. But that is not all. Our party program, a document which the author of the ABC of Communism knows very well, shows that ours is a workers' state with a bureaucratic twist to it. We have had to mark it with this dismal, shall I say, tag. There you have the reality of the transition. Well, is it right to say that in a state that has taken this shape in practice the trade unions have nothing to protect, or that we can do without them in protecting the material and spiritual interests of the massively organized proletariat? No, this reasoning is theoretically quite wrong. It takes us into the sphere of abstraction or an ideal we shall achieve in 15 or 20 years' time, and I am not so sure that we shall have achieved it even by then. What we actually have before us is a reality of which we have a good deal of knowledge, provided, that is, we keep our heads, and do not let ourselves be carried away by intellectualist talk or abstract reasoning, or by what may appear to be theory but is in fact error and misapprehension of the peculiarities of transition. We now have a state under which it is the business of the massively organized proletariat to protect itself, while we, for our part, must use these workers' organizations to protect the workers from their state, and to get them to protect our state. Both forms of protection are achieved through the peculiar interweaving of our state measures and our agreeing or coalescing with our trade unions. I shall have more to say about this coalescing later on. But the word itself shows that it is a mistake to conjure up an enemy in the shape of Soviet trade unionism, for coalescing implies the existence of distinct things that have yet to be coalesced. Coalescing implies the need to be able to use measures of the state power to protect the material and spiritual interests of the massively organized proletariat from that very same state power. When the coalescing has produced coalescence and integration, we shall meet in Congress for a business-like discussion of actual experience, instead of disagreements on principle or theoretical reasoning in the abstract. There is an equally lame attempt to find differences of principle with comrades Tomsky and Lazovsky, whom Comrade Trotsky treats as trade union bureaucrats. I shall later on say which side in this controversy tends to be bureaucratic. We all know that while Comrade Ryazanov may love a slogan, and must have one which is all but an expression of principle, it is not one of Comrade Tomsky's many vices. I think, therefore, that it would be going a bit too far to challenge Comrade Tomsky to a battle of principles on this score, as Comrade Trotsky has done. I am positively astonished at this. One would have thought that we had grown up since the days when we all sinned a great deal in the way of factional, theoretical and various other disagreements, although we naturally did some good as well. It is time we stopped inventing and blowing up differences of principle and got down to practical work. I never knew that Tomsky was eminently a theoretician or that he claimed to be one. It may be one of his failings, but that is something else again. Tomsky, who has been working very smoothly with the trade union movement, must in his position provide a reflection of this complex transition. Whether he should do so consciously or unconsciously is quite another matter, and I am not saying that he has always done it consciously, so that if something is hurting the mass, and they do not know what it is, and he does not know what it is, applause, laughter, but raises a howl, I say that is not a failing but should be put down to his credit. I am quite sure that Tomsky has many partial theoretical mistakes. And if we all sat down to a table and started thoughtfully writing resolutions or theses, we should correct them all. We might not even bother to do that because production work is more interesting than the rectifying of minute theoretical disagreements. I come now to industrial democracy, shall I say, for Bukharin's benefit. We all know that everyone has his weak points, that even big men have little weak spots, and this also goes for Bukharin. He seems to be incapable of resisting any little word with a flourish to it. He seemed to derive an almost sensuous pleasure from writing the resolution on industrial democracy at the Central Committee plenum on December 7. But the closer I look at this industrial democracy, the more clearly I see that it is half-baked and theoretically false. It is nothing but a hodgepodge. With this as an example, let me say once again, at a party meeting at least Comrade N.I. Bukharin, the Republic, theory and you yourself will benefit from less verbal extravagance. Applause. Industry is indispensable. Democracy is a category proper only to the political sphere. There can be no objection to the use of this word in speeches or articles. An article takes up and clearly expresses one relationship and no more. But it is quite strange to hear you trying to turn this into a thesis, and to see you wanting to coin it into a slogan, uniting the ayes and the nays. It is strange to hear you say, like Trotsky, that the party will have to choose between two trends. I shall deal separately with whether the party must do any choosing and who is to blame for putting the party in this position of having to choose. Things being what they are, we say at any rate, see that you choose fewer slogans, like industrial democracy, which contain nothing but confusion and are theoretically wrong. Both Trotsky and Bukharin failed to think out this term theoretically and ended up in confusion. Industrial democracy suggests things well beyond the circle of ideas with which they were carried away. They wanted to lay greater emphasis and focus attention on industry. It is one thing to emphasize something in an article or speech, it is quite another to frame it into a thesis and ask the party to choose, and so I say cast your vote against it, because it is confusion. Industry is indispensable, democracy is not. Industrial democracy breeds some utterly false ideas. The idea of one-man management was advocated only a little while ago. We must not make a mess of things and confuse people. How do you expect them to know when you want democracy, when one-man management, and when dictatorship? But on no account must we renounce dictatorship either. I hear Bukharin behind me growling. Quite right. Laughter. Applause. But to go on. Since September we have been talking about switching from the principle of priority to that of equalization, and we have said as much in the resolution of the All-Party Conference, which was approved by the Central Committee. Footnote 4, the question is not an easy one, because we find that we have to combine equalization with priority, which are incompatible. But after all we do have some knowledge of Marxism and have learned how and when opposites can and must be combined, and what is most important is that in the 3.5 years of our revolution we have actually combined opposites again and again. The question obviously requires thoughtfulness and circumspection. After all, we did discuss these questions of principle at those deplorable plenary meetings of the Central Committee, footnote 4b, which yielded the groups of 7 and 8, and Comrade Bukharin's celebrated buffer group, footnote 6, and we did establish that there was no easy transition from the priority principle to that of equalization. We shall have to put in a bit of effort to implement the decision of the September conference. After all, these opposite terms can be combined either into a cacophony or a symphony. Priority implies preference for one industry out of a group of vital industries because of its greater urgency. What does such preference entail? How great can it be? This is a difficult question, and I must say that it will take more than zeal to solve it. It may even take more than a heroic effort on the part of a man who is possibly endowed with many excellent qualities and who will do wonders on the right job. This is a very peculiar matter and calls for the correct approach. And so if we are to raise this question of priority and equalization we must first of all give it some careful thought, but that is just what we fail to find in Comrade Trotsky's work. The further he goes in revising his original theses, the more mistakes he makes. Here is what we find in his latest theses. The equalization line should be pursued in the sphere of consumption, that is, the conditions of the working people's existence as individuals. In the sphere of production, the principle of priority will long remain decisive for us. Thesis 41, p. 31 of Trotsky's pamphlet. This is a real theoretical muddle. It is all wrong. Priority is preference, but it is nothing without preference in consumption. If all the preference I get is a couple of ounces of bread a day, I am not likely to be very happy. The preference part of priority implies preference in consumption as well. Otherwise, priority is a pipe dream, a fleeting cloud, and we are, after all, materialists. The workers are also materialists. If you say shock work, they say, let's have the bread, and the clothes, and the beef. That is the view we now take, and have always taken, in discussing these questions time without number with reference to various concrete matters in the Council of Defense. Footnote 7, when one would say I'm doing shock work, and would clamor for boots, and another I get the boots, otherwise your shock workers won't hold out, and all your priority will fizzle out. We find, therefore, that in the theses the approach to equalization and priority is basically wrong. What is more, it is a retreat from what has actually been achieved and tested in practice. We can't have that, it will lead to no good. Then there is the question of coalescing. The best thing to do about coalescing right now is to keep quiet. Speech is silver, but silence is golden. Why so? It is because we have got down to coalescing in practice. There is not a single large governing economic council, no major department of the Supreme Economic Council, the People's Commissariat for Communications, etc., where something is not being coalesced in practice. But are the results all they should be? There's the rub. Look at the way coalescence has actually been carried out, and what it has produced. There are countless decrees introducing coalescence in the various institutions. But we have yet to make a business-like study of our own practical experience, we have yet to go into the actual results of all this, we have yet to discover what a certain type of coalescence has produced in a particular industry, what happened when member X of the Governia Trade Union Council held post Y in the Governia Economic Council, how many months he was at it, etc. What we have not failed to do is to invent a disagreement on coalescence as a principle, and make a mistake in the process, but then we have always been quick at that sort of thing, but we were not up to the mark when it came to analyzing and verifying our own experience. When we have congresses of Soviets with committees not only on the application of the better farming law in the various agricultural areas but also on coalescence and its results in the Saratov Governia flour milling industry, the Petrograd metal industry, the Donbass coal industry, etc., and when these committees, having mustered the facts, declare we have made a study of so and so, then I shall say now we have got down to business, we have finally grown up. But could anything be more erroneous and deplorable than the fact that we are being presented with theses splitting hairs over the principle of coalescence? After we have been at it for 3 years we have taken the path of coalescence, and I am sure it was the right thing to do, but we have not yet made an adequate study of the results of our experience. That is why keeping quiet is the only common sense tactics on the question of coalescence. A study must be made of practical experience. I have signed decrees and resolutions containing instructions on practical coalescence, and no theory is half so important as practice. That is why when I hear let's discuss coalescence, I say let's analyze what we have done. There is no doubt that we have made many mistakes. It may well be that a great part of our decrees need amending. I accept that, for I am not in the least enamored of decrees. But in that case let us have some practical proposals as to what actually has to be altered. That would be a business-like approach. That would not be a waste of time. That would not lead to bureaucratic projecteering, but I find that that is exactly what's wrong with Trotsky's practical conclusions, part 6 of his pamphlet. He says that from 1/3 to 1/2 of the members of the All-Russia Central Council of Trade Unions and the Presidium of the Supreme Economic Council should serve on both bodies, and from 1/2 to 2/3, on the collegiums, etc. Why so? No special reason, just rule of thumb. It is true, of course, that rule of thumb is frequently used to lay down similar proportions in our decrees, but then why is it inevitable in decrees? I hold no brief for all decrees as such and have no intention of making them appear better than they actually are. Quite often rule of thumb is used in them to fix such purely arbitrary proportions as 1/2 or 1/3 of the total number of members, etc. When a decree says that, it means try doing it this way, and later on we shall assess the results of your tryout. We shall later sort out the results. After sorting them out, we shall move on. We are working on coalescence and we expect to improve it because we are becoming more efficient and practical-minded. But I seem to have lapsed into production propaganda. That can't be helped. It is a question that needs dealing with in any discussion of the role of the trade unions in production. My next question will therefore be that of production propaganda. This again is a practical matter and we approach it accordingly. Government agencies have already been set up to conduct production propaganda. I can't tell whether they are good or bad. They have to be tested and there's no need for any theses on this subject at all. If we take a general view of the part trade unions have to play in industry, we need not, in this question of democracy, go beyond the usual democratic practices. Nothing will come of such tricky phrases as industrial democracy, for they are all wrong. That is the first point. The second is production propaganda. The agencies are there. Trotsky's theses deal with production propaganda. That is quite useless, because in this case theses are old hat. We do not know as yet whether the agencies are good or bad. But we can tell after testing them in action. Let us do some studying and polling. Assuming, let us say, that a Congress has 10 committees with 10 men on each, Let us ask you have been dealing with production propaganda, haven't you? What are the results? Having made a study of this, we should reward those who have done especially well, and discard what has proved unsuccessful. We do have some practical experience, it may not be much but it is there, yet we are being dragged away from it and back to these theses on principles. This looks more like a reactionary movement than trade unionism. There is then the third point, that of bonuses. Here is the role and task of the trade unions in production distribution of bonuses in kind. A start on it has been made. Things have been set in motion. 500,000 poods of grain had been allocated for the purpose, and 170,000 has been distributed. How well and how correctly, I cannot tell. The Council of People's Commissars was told that they were not making a good job of this distribution, which turned out to be an additional wage rather than a bonus. This was pointed out by officials of the trade unions and the People's Commissariat for Labor. We appointed a commission to look into the matter, but that has not yet been done. 170,000 poods of grain has been given away, but this needs to be done in such a way as to reward those who display the heroism, the zeal, the talent, and the dedication of the thrifty manager, in a word, all the qualities that Trotsky extols. But the task now is not to extol this in theses but to provide the bread and the beef. Wouldn't it be better, for instance, to deprive one category of workers of their beef and give it as a bonus to workers designated as shock workers? We do not renounce that kind of priority. That is a priority we need. Let us take a closer look at our practices in the application of priority. The fourth point is disciplinary courts. I hope Comrade Bukharin will not take offense if I say that without disciplinary courts the role of the trade unions in industry, industrial democracy, is a mere trifle. But the fact is that there is nothing at all about this in your theses. Great grief is therefore the only thing that can be said about Trotsky's theses and Bukharin's attitude, from the standpoint of principle, theory and practice. I am confirmed in this conclusion when I say to myself yours is not a Marxist approach to the question. This quite apart from the fact that there are a number of theoretical mistakes in the theses, it is not a Marxist approach to the evaluation of the role and tasks of the trade unions, because such a broad subject cannot be tackled without giving thought to the peculiar political aspects of the present situation. After all, Comrade Bukharin and I did say in the resolution of the 9th Congress of the RCP on trade unions that politics is the most concentrated expression of economics. If we analyzed the current political situation, we might say that we were going through a transition period within a transition period. The whole of the dictatorship of the proletariat is a transition period, but we now have, you might say, a heap of new transition periods: the demobilization of the army, the end of the war, the possibility of having a much longer breathing space in peace than before, and a more solid transition from the war front to the labor front. This and this alone is causing a change in the attitude of the proletarian class to the peasant class. What kind of change is it now? This calls for a close examination, but nothing of the sort follows from your theses. Until we have taken this close look, we must learn to wait. The people are overweary. Considerable stocks that had to be used for certain priority industries have been so used. The proletariat's attitude to the peasantry is undergoing a change. The war weariness is terrible, and the needs have increased, but production has increased insufficiently or not at all. On the other hand, as I said in my report to the 8th Congress of Soviets, our application of coercion was correct and successful whenever we had been able to back it up from the start with persuasion. I must say that Trotsky and Bukharin have entirely failed to take account of this very important consideration. Have we laid a sufficiently broad and solid base of persuasion for all these new production tasks? No, indeed, we have barely started doing it. We have not yet made the masses a party to them. Now I ask you, can the masses tackle these new assignments right away? No, they cannot, because while there is now no need for special propaganda on the question of, say, whether Wrangel the landowner should be overthrown or whether any sacrifices should be spared for the purpose, we have just started to work on this question of the role of the trade unions in production, and I mean the business aspect of the matter and not the question of principle, the reasoning about Soviet trade unionism, and such like trifles. We have just set up the agency for production propaganda, but we have as yet no experience. We have introduced the payment of bonuses in kind, but we lack the experience. We have set up the disciplinary courts, but we are not yet aware of the results. Still, from the political standpoint, it is the preparedness of the masses that is crucial. Has the question been prepared, studied, weighed, and considered from this angle? No, far from it. And that is a basic, deep-going and dangerous political mistake, because if ever there was need to act according to the rule of measuring your cloth 7 times before cutting it once, it is in this question. We find instead that the cutting has been started in earnest without a single measure having been taken. We are told that the party must choose between 2 trends, but the false slogan of industrial democracy was invented without a single measuring. We must try to understand the meaning of the slogan, especially in the present political situation, when the masses are confronted with bureaucratic practices in visual form, and when we have the question itself on the agenda. Comrade Trotsky says in his theses that on the question of workers' democracy it remains for the Congress to enter it unanimously in the record. That is not correct. There is more to it than an entry in the record. An entry in the record fixes what has been fully weighed and measured, whereas the question of industrial democracy is far from having been fully weighed, tried and tested. Just think how the masses may interpret the slogan of industrial democracy. We, the rank and file who work among the masses, say that there is need for new blood, that things must be corrected and the bureaucrats ousted, and here you are beating about the bush, talking about getting on with production and displaying democracy in achieving success in production. We refuse to get on with production under such a bureaucratic setup of central and other boards. We want a different one. You have not given the masses a chance to discuss things, to see the point, and to think it over. You have not allowed the party to gain fresh experience but are already acting in haste, overdoing it, and producing formulas which are theoretically false. Just think how this mistake will be further amplified by unduly zealous functionaries. A political leader is responsible not only for the quality of his leadership but also for the acts of those he leads. He may now and again be unaware of what they are about, he may often wish they had not done something, but the responsibility still falls on him. I now come to the November 9th and December 7th plenary meetings of the Central Committee, which gave expression to all these mistakes in action, rather than in logical categories, premises and theoretical reasoning. This threw the Central Committee into confusion. It is the first time this has happened in our party's history, in time of revolution, and it is dangerous. The crux was that there was a division. There was the buffer group of Bukharin, Preobrazhensky and Serebryakov, which did the most harm and created the most confusion. You will recall the story of Globpolitput, footnote 8, and Tsektran footnote 9. The resolution of the 9th Congress of the RCP in April 1920 said that Globpolitput was being set up as a temporary institution, and that conditions should be brought back to normal as soon as possible. In September you read, return to normal conditions footnote 9b. The plenary meeting was held in November 9th, and Trotsky came up with his theses and ideas about trade unionism. However fine some of his points about production propaganda may be, he should have been told that all this was neither here nor there, quite beside the mark, and a step backward. It is something the CC should not be dealing with at present. Bukharin says it is very good. It may be very good, but that is no answer to the question. After a heated debate, a resolution is adopted by 10-4 saying in a polite and comradely way that Tsektran has itself already got down to strengthening and developing methods of proletarian democracy within the Union. It adds that Tsektran must take an active part in the general work of the All-Russia Central Council of Trade Unions, being incorporated in it on an equal footing with other trade union bodies. What is the gist of the Central Committee's decision? It is obviously this, comrades of Tsektran. You must do more than go through the motions of carrying out Congress and CC decisions. You must actually do so to help all trade unions by your work, wipe out every trace of red tape, favoritism, arrogance, the we are better than you attitude, and boasts of being richer and getting more aid. We then get down to brass tacks. A commission is set up, and the names of its members are published. Trotsky walks out, refuses to serve on the commission, and disrupts its work. What are his reasons? There is only one. Litvinov is apt to play at opposition. That is true, and that also goes for Osinski. Frankly speaking, it is not a pleasant game. But do you call that a reason? Osinski was making an excellent job of the seed campaign. The thing to do was to work with him, in spite of his opposition campaign, for this business of disrupting the work of a commission is bureaucratic, un-Soviet, unsocialist, incorrect and politically harmful. Such methods are doubly incorrect and politically harmful at a time when there is need to separate the wheat from the chaff within the opposition. When Osinski conducts an opposition campaign, I tell him this is a harmful campaign, but it is a pleasure to see him conduct the seed campaign. I shall not deny that, like Ishchenko and Shlyapnikov, Litvinov is making a mistake in his opposition campaign, but that is no reason to disrupt the work of a commission. What did the commission in fact signify? It signified transition to practical work from intellectualist talk about sterile disagreements. What the commission was due to discuss and deal with was production propaganda, bonuses, and disciplinary courts. It was then that Comrade Bukharin, the head of the buffer group, together with Preobrazhensky and Serebryakov, seeing the Central Committee dangerously divided, set out to create a buffer, one that I find difficult to describe in parliamentary terms. If I could draw cartoons as well as Comrade Bukharin does, I would depict him as a man pouring a bucket of kerosene on the flames, and give the following caption: Buffer Kerosene. Comrade Bukharin wanted to create something, and his intentions were no doubt most sincere and entirely in the buffer spirit. But the buffer failed to materialize. The upshot was that he failed to take account of the political situation and, what is more, made some theoretical mistakes. Should all such disputes have been brought up for broad discussion? Was it worth going into these trifles? Was it worth wasting the few precious weeks before a party congress? We could have used the TIMO to analyze and study the question of bonuses, disciplinary courts and coalescence. Those are the questions we could have given a practical solution to in the CC Commission. If Comrade Bukharin wished to create a buffer, instead of giving a display of barking up the wrong tree, he should have demanded and insisted that Comrade Trotsky remained on the commission. If he had said and done that, we should have been on the right track, with the commission looking into the practical aspects of such things as one-man management, democracy, appointees, etc. But to go on. By December, the December 7th plenary meeting, we were already faced with this flare-up of the watermen, which intensified the conflict, and as a result there were now 8 votes in the Central Committee to our 7. Comrade Bukharin, in an effort to bring about a reconciliation through the use of his buffer, hastily wrote the theoretical part of the December plenum's resolution, but with the commission a shambles, nothing, of course, could come of it. Where did Glopolitbut and Tsektran err? Certainly not in their use of coercion, that goes to their credit. Their mistake was that they failed to switch to normal trade union work at the right time and without conflict, as the 9th Congress of the RCP required. They failed to adapt themselves to the trade unions and help them by meeting them on an equal footing. Heroism, zeal, etc., are the positive side of military experience. Red tape and arrogance are the negative side of the experience of the worst military types. Trotsky's theses, whatever his intentions, do not tend to play up the best, but the worst in military experience. It must be borne in mind that a political leader is responsible not only for his own policy but also for the acts of those he leads. The last thing I want to tell you about something I called myself a fool for yesterday is that I had altogether overlooked Comrade Rudzudok's theses. His weak point is that he does not speak in ringing tones. He is not an impressive or eloquent speaker. He is liable to be overlooked. Unable to attend the meetings yesterday, I went through my material and found a printed leaflet issued for the 5th All-Russia Trade Union Conference, which was held from November 2 to 6, 1920. Footnote 11, it is called The Tasks of the Trade Unions in Production. Let me read it to you, it is not long. Fifth All-Russia Trade Union Conference, the tasks of the trade unions in production, theses of Comrade Rudzutok's report. 1. Immediately after the October Revolution, the trade unions proved to be almost the only bodies which, while exercising workers' control, were able and bound to undertake the work of organizing and managing production. In that early period of the Soviet power, no state apparatus for the management of the national economy had yet been set up, while sabotage on the part of factory owners and senior technicians brought the working class squarely up against the task of safeguarding industry and getting the whole of the country's economic apparatus back into normal running order. 2. In the subsequent period of the Supreme Economic Council's work, when a considerable part of it consisted in liquidating private enterprises and organizing state management to run them, the trade unions carried on this work jointly and side by side with the state economic management agencies. This parallel setup was explained and justified by the weakness of the state agencies. Historically, it was vindicated by the establishment of full contact between the trade unions and the economic management agencies. 3. The center of gravity in the management of industry and the drafting of a production program shifted to these agencies as a result of their administration, the gradual spread of their control over production and management, and the coordination of the several parts. In view of this, the work of the trade unions in organizing production was reduced to participation in forming the collegiums of chief administrations, central boards, and factory managements. 4. At the present time, we are once again squarely faced with the question of establishing the closest possible ties between the economic agencies of the Soviet Republic and the trade unions, for the best use must be made of every working individual, and the whole mass of producers must be induced to take a conscious part in production, for the state apparatus of economic management, gradually gaining in size and complexity, has been transformed into a huge bureaucratic machine which is out of all proportion to the scale of industry, and is inevitably impelling the trade unions to take direct part in organizing production not only through its men in the economic agencies but also as an organized whole. 5. While the Supreme Economic Council's point of departure in drawing up an overall production program is the availability of the material elements of production, raw materials, fuel, the state of machinery, etc., the trade unions must look at it from the standpoint of organizing labor for the tasks of production and its best use. Therefore, the overall production program, in whole and in part, must be drawn up with the participation of the trade unions in order to combine the use of the material resources of production and manpower in the best possible way. 6. Only if the whole mass of those engaged in production consciously take a hand in establishing real labor discipline, fighting deserters from the labor front, etc., can these tasks be fulfilled. Bureaucratic methods and orders will not do. It must be brought home to each participant in production that his production tasks are appropriate and important, that each must take a hand not only in fulfilling his assignments, but also play an intelligent part in correcting any technical and organizational defects in the sphere of production. The tasks of the trade unions in this sphere are tremendous. They must teach their members in each shop and in each factory to react to and take account of all defects in the use of manpower arising from improper handling of technical means or unsatisfactory management. The sum total of the experience gained by separate enterprises and industry as a whole must be used to combat red tape, bureaucratic practices and carelessness. 7. In order to lay special emphasis on the importance of these production tasks, they must be organizationally worked into current operations. As the economic departments of the trade unions, which are being set up in pursuance of the decision of the Third All-Russia Congress, extend their activity, they must gradually explain and define the nature of all trade union work. Thus, in the present social conditions, when all of production is geared to the satisfaction of the working people's needs, wage rates and bonuses must be closely tied in with and must depend on the extent to which the production plan is fulfilled. Bonuses in kind and partial payment of wages in kind must be gradually transformed into a system of workers' supply which depends on the level of labor productivity. 8. Trade union work on these lines would, on the one hand, put an end to the existence of parallel bodies, political departments, etc., and, on the other, restore the close ties between the masses and the economic management agencies. 9. After the Third Congress, the trade unions largely failed to carry out their program for participation in economic construction owing, first, to the military conditions, and second, to their organizational weakness and isolation from the administrative and practical work of the economic bodies. 10. In view of this, the trade unions should set themselves the following immediate practical tasks: a. The most active participation in solving production and management problems, b. Direct participation, with the respective economic agencies, in setting up competent administrative bodies, c. Careful consideration of the various types of management bodies, and their influence on production, d. Unfailing participation in working out and laying down economic plans and production programs, e. Organization of labor in accordance with the economic priorities, f. Development of an extensive organization for production agitation and propaganda. 11. The economic departments of the trade unions and of their organizations must be actually transformed into powerful and expeditious levers for the trade unions' systematic participation in organizing production. 12. In the matter of providing workers with steady material supplies, the trade unions must shift their influence onto the distribution bodies of the Commissariat for Food, both local and central, taking a practical and business-like part and exercising control in all the distributive bodies, and paying special attention to the activity of central and gubernia workers' supply commissions. 13. In view of the fact that the narrow departmental interests of some chief administrations, central boards, etc., have plunged the so-called priority into a state of utter confusion, the trade unions must everywhere uphold the real order of economic priorities and review the existing system so as to determine them in accordance with the actual importance of the various industries and the availability of material resources in the country. 14. Special attention must be given to the so-called model group of factories to help them set an example through the organization of efficient management, labor discipline and trade union activities. 15. In labor organization, apart from the introduction of a harmonious wage rate system and the overhaul of output rates, the trade unions should take a firm hand in fighting the various forms of labor desertion, absenteeism, lateness, etc. The disciplinary courts, which have not received due attention until now, must be turned into a real means of combating breaches of proletarian labor discipline. 16. The economic departments must be entrusted with the fulfillment of these tasks and also the drafting of a practical plan for production propaganda and a number of measures to improve the economic condition of the workers. It is necessary, therefore, to authorize the economic department of the All-Russia Central Council of Trade Unions to call a special All-Russia Conference of Economic Departments in the near future to discuss the practical problems of economic construction in connection with the world of state economic agencies. I hope you see now why I called myself names. There you have a platform, and it is very much better than the one Comrade Trotsky wrote after a great deal of thinking, and the one Comrade Bukharin wrote, the December 7th plenum resolution, without any thinking at all. All of us members of the Central Committee who have been out of touch with the trade union movement for many years would profit from Comrade Rudzutak's experience, and this also goes for Comrade Trotsky and Comrade Bukharin. The trade unions have adopted this platform. We all entirely forgot about the disciplinary courts, but industrial democracy, without bonuses in kind or disciplinary courts, is nothing but empty talk. I make a comparison between Rudzutak's theses and those submitted by Trotsky to the Central Committee. At the end of Thesis 5, I read: a reorganization of the unions must be started right away, that is, a selection of functionaries must be above all made from precisely that angle. There you have an example of the real bureaucratic approach: Trotsky and Krestinsky selecting the trade union functionaries. Let me say this once again: here you have an explanation of Tsektran's mistake. It was not wrong to use pressure, that goes to its credit. It made the mistake of failing to cope with the general tasks of all the trade unions, of failing to act itself and to help all the trade unions to employ the disciplinary comrades' courts more correctly, swiftly and successfully. When I read about the disciplinary courts in Comrade Rudzutak's theses, it occurred to me that there might be a decree on this matter. and in fact there was. It is the regulations governing workers' disciplinary comrades courts, issued on November 14, 1919, collection of statutes number 537. The trade unions have the key role in these courts. I don't know how good these courts are, how well they function, and whether they always function. A study of our own practical experience would be a great deal more useful than anything comrades Trotsky and Bukharin have written. Let me end by summing up everything there is on the question. I must say that it was a great mistake to put up these disagreements for broad party discussion and the party congress. It was a political mistake. We should have had a business-like discussion in the commission, and only there, and would have in that case moved forward. As it is, we are sliding back, and shall keep sliding back to abstract theoretical propositions for several weeks, instead of dealing with the problem in a business-like manner. Personally, I am sick and tired of it, and quite apart from my illness, it would give me great pleasure to get away from it all. I am prepared to seek refuge anywhere. The net result is that there are a number of theoretical mistakes in Trotsky's and Bukharin's theses. They contain a number of things that are wrong in principle. Politically, the whole approach to the matter is utterly tactless. Comrade Trotsky's theses are politically harmful. The sum and substance of his policy is bureaucratic harassment of the trade unions. Our party congress will, I am sure, condemn and reject it. Prolonged, stormy applause. Endnotes. 1. Lenin's first speech to party activists in the discussion of the role and tasks of the trade unions in socialist construction was delivered at the Bolshoi Theater on December 30, 1920. Trotsky had started the discussion in the communist group of the Fifth All-Russia Trade Union Conference on November 3 with his call to tighten the screws of war communism as opposed to the party's line to stimulate democratic activity in the trade unions. The disagreements turned on the different approach to the mass, the way of winning it over, and keeping in touch with it, Lenin. The disagreements in the group were brought before the Central Committee plenary meeting. But Trotsky's December 24 speech before the delegates of the 8th All-Russia Congress of Soviets and trade union activists carried the issue outside the Central Committee. On December 25, he published his views in a pamphlet. Lenin was against any discussion, believing that it distracted the party's attention and forces from the immediate tasks of fighting the economic dislocation and the famine. In his speeches and articles The Party Crisis and once again on the trade unions, the current situation and the mistakes of Trotsky and Bukharin, he put forward and developed a number of important principles underlying the trade unions' role in the dictatorship of the proletariat and their tasks in socialist construction. The discussion lasted more than 2 months. The overwhelming majority of the party organizations approved Lenin's platform and rejected the opposition's. The results of the discussion were summed up at the 10th Congress of the party on March 8 to 16, 1921. 2. On its agenda were the current tasks of economic construction and the question of the trade union movement. It defined the short-term economic tasks and stressed the need for the trade unions' active participation in socialist construction. It adopted the following resolutions: the current tasks of economic construction and the trade unions and their organization. CKPSSV Rezoluciak I Rashiniak Sizdov, Konferencji I Plenum of TSK, the CPSU in the resolutions and decisions of congresses, conferences and CC plenary meetings, Part 1, 1954, pages 477 to 90, 490 to 94. 3. The reference is to the 8th All-Russia Congress of Soviets of Workers, Peasants, Red Army and Cossack deputies held in Moscow on December 22 to 29, 1920. It was attended by 2,537 delegates, the greatest number ever. Of them 1,728 had voice and vote, and 809, voice only. Of the total number of delegates, 91.7% were communists, 2.7, communist sympathizers, 3.9, non-party people, 0.3, Mensheviks, 0.3, Bundists, 0.15, left SRS, 0.15, anarchists, and 0.8 from other parties. The Congress met at a time when the war against the foreign intervention and internal counter-revolution was coming to an end, and when the economic front stood out as the main and most important one, Lenin. On its agenda there were the following questions, the chief of which had been discussed beforehand by the Communist Group report on the activity of the All-Russia Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars, electrification of Russia, rehabilitation of industry and transport, development of agricultural production and promotion of farming, efficiency of Soviet establishments and the struggle against bureaucratic practices. These problems were thrashed out in three sections: industry, agriculture and Soviet administration. Lenin guided much of the work of the Congress. At the plenary meeting on December 22, he gave a report on the activity of the All-Russia Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars, and on December 23, he summed up the debate. He spoke 6 times at the Communist Group meetings on December 21, 22, 24 and 27 on the question of concessions and the draft law on measures to consolidate and develop peasant farming. By an overwhelming majority, the Congress adopted a resolution on Lenin's report, approving the government's activity, and rejected a draft resolution motioned by the other delegates. The Congress adopted a plan for the electrification of the country, GOELRO, worked out on Lenin's initiative and instructions. This was the first long-range economic plan of the Soviet state and Lenin called it the Second Party Program. He also wrote the resolution on Khrushchevsky's report. Another major question on the agenda was a draft law on measures to consolidate and develop peasant farming, which had been adopted by the Council of People's Commissars on December 14, 1920. Lenin stressed that the law was a kind of a focus around which hundreds of decrees and bills of the Soviet power were grouped. Lenin took part in the discussion of its principal clauses by the non-party peasant delegates to the Congress at a special meeting on December 22, and by the Communist Group on December 24 and 27. The draft law was adopted unanimously. The Congress passed a comprehensive resolution to improve and reorganize the entire Soviet apparatus as required by the transition to peaceful economic construction. It regulated relations between central and local organs of power and administration. The Congress also discussed the reorganization of the whole system of economic management in accordance with the new economic tasks, and approved a new statute of the Council of Labor and Defense. It instituted the Order of the Red Banner of Labor as an award for dedication, initiative, efficiency and hard work in solving economic tasks. 4. The reference is to the resolution of the 9th All-Russia Conference of the RCP. B. The current tasks of party organization. CKPSSV Rezoluciak. The CPSU in the resolutions and decisions of congresses, conferences and CC plenary meetings, Part 1, 1954, pages 506-12. 4b. The reference is to the November and December plenary meeting of the Central Committee in 1920. For the text of their resolution see Pravda number 255 of November 13, and number 281 of December 14, and also Izvestia of the CC, RCP footnote 5, number 26 of December 20. 5. Izvestia of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party was an information organ dealing with party problems. It was published under a resolution of the 8th Congress of the RCP. B. As a weekly supplement to Pravda from May 28, 1919, and as an independent organ from October 1920. In 1929, it was transformed into a fortnightly, Partijnvoystrojitelstvo, party construction, and in June 1946 renamed Partijnaya Zhizn, party life. 6. The buffer group took shape during the trade union discussion in 1920-21. It was headed by N.I. Bukharin and included Y. Lenin, Y.A. Preobrazhensky, L.P. Serebryakov, G.Y. Sokolnikov, V.N. Yakovleva and others. They tried to reconcile the differences between Lenin and Trotsky's views, acting as a buffer in disagreements on the question of the role and tasks of the trade unions. In fact, Bukharin attacked Lenin and defended Trotsky. Lenin characterized the buffer group and its anti-party views in his article, The Party Crisis, in the pamphlet, once again on the trade unions, the current situation and the mistakes of Trotsky and Bukharin, and elsewhere. 7. The Council of Workers' and Peasants' Defense was set up by the All-Russia Central Executive Committee on November 30, 1918, to implement its September 2, 1918 decree which proclaimed the Soviet Republic a military camp. Lenin was appointed its chairman. It was vested with extraordinary powers in mobilizing the resources of the Soviet state for defense in that exceptionally difficult period. The council was the Republic's chief military economic and planning center during the intervention and civil war and also controlled the activity of the Revolutionary Military Council and other military organs. Its decrees were binding on all Soviet citizens, as well as on central and local agencies. Early in April 1920, it was reorganized into the Council of Labor and Defense, CLD, Soviet Truda I Obranisto, and under a decision of the 8th All-Russia Congress of Soviets in December 1920 it began to operate as a government commission responsible for coordinating the work of all economic departments. It was abolished in 1937. 8. Globpolitbud, the chief political department of the People's Commissariat for Communications, was formed as a provisional organ under the direct leadership of the party's Central Committee in February 1919, and in January 1920 it was renamed the Chief Political Administration. It took extraordinary measures to rehabilitate the railways that had been ruined in the imperialist war and the Civil War, to improve party and political work among railway workers, and to strengthen and stimulate the activity of the Railwaymen's Trade Union and make it an instrument for the further development of the railways. It introduced military discipline on the railways to gear them to the war effort. The measures effected by Globpolitbud saved the railways from utter ruin, but produced bureaucratic and undemocratic practices in the trade unions and a tendency to lose touch with the masses. It was abolished by a Central Committee decision on December 7, 1920, at the end of the Civil War and the start of peaceful development. 9. Tsektran, the Central Committee of the Joint Trade Union of Rail and Water Transport Workers. In September 1920, the two unions were merged to set up a strong centralized administration capable of tackling the tasks of rapidly rehabilitating transport, whose stoppages tended to paralyze the national economy. Its extraordinary powers and military methods of work, which sprang from the enormity of the tasks before it, bred bureaucratic practices, the appointments system, administration by injunction, etc. The plenary meetings of the CC on November 8 and December 7, 1920, condemned Tsektran's methods and adopted a decision to incorporate it into the general system of the All-Russia Central Council of Trade Unions on a par with other unions. Tsektral was advised to change its methods, develop trade union democracy, make all trade union bodies elective, reduce the appointments system, etc. The first All-Russia Congress of Transport Workers in March 1921, called by the Central Committee of the party, expelled those communists who opposed this reform from the Tsektran leadership and outlined new methods of work. 9b. See Izvestia of the CC, RCP number 26, p2, the resolution of the September plenum of the CC, paragraph 3, which said the CC further believes that there has been a great improvement in the grave situation in the transport workers' unions, which produced Globpolitbud and Politvod, 10 as temporary levers for assisting and organizing the work. Therefore, incorporation of these organizations in the union, as union agencies being adapted to and absorbed by the union apparatus, can and must now proceed. 10. Politvod, the chief political administration of water transport of the People's Commissariat for Communications, was set up in April 1920 as an agency of Globpolitbud to carry on political education among the workers and exercise political control over the technical and administrative personnel, to put water transport on its feet as soon as possible, to stimulate higher productivity and improve discipline. It was dissolved in December 1920. 11. The party wanted the trade unions' work reorganized in accordance with the tasks of peaceful socialist construction, democracy developed and military methods of administration abolished. This was opposed by Trotsky, who demanded, at the Communist Group meeting on November 3, a shake-up of the trade unions. He wanted the screws tightened and the trade unions governmentalist immediately. He disagreed on the approach to the mass, the way of winning it over, and keeping in touch with it. His speech started the party discussion on the trade unions, but the communist delegates rejected his demands, for their realization would have abolished the trade unions and undermined the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is why his theses were discussed by the party Central Committee. At the November 8 CC plenary meeting, Lenin came out with his own theses which, when put to the vote, won 8 votes, as against 7 for Trotsky's.